few years back, I spent close to 5 months in rehab, clawing my way out of an addiction that nearly consumed me. I saw all sorts of people come and go during that time, faces that haunted their own shadows, worn down by life, demons wrapped around every corner of their minds. But no one was like Aaron. He came in one rainy night, drenched and looking worn down to his bones. Late 30s, maybe 40, with eyes that looked like they'd seen far too much. The techs warned us to be careful around him. Aaron had severe schizophrenia, they said. He was a man lost in his own mind, fighting battles no one else could see. But I knew there was more to it than that. It wasn't just Aaron who had me on edge. It was something darker, something that seemed to hang around him like a shadow no light could touch. The rehab center was like an old motel. Narrow corridors, creaky floors, and a faint chill that seeped into everything. Aaron ended up in my unit, and the first time I saw him, I made an effort to be friendly, to let him know he wasn't alone. We're all here to face our own demons, Aaron. If you ever need anything, I'm just down the hall, I told him. He looked up at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something pleading in his eyes. He managed a small nod, but the words caught in his throat. That was the last time he looked at me with any trace of himself still left. The first night, I heard him talking. At first, it was low murmurs, whispers just loud enough to be unsettling. Then, as the hours ticked by, the whispers grew sharper, angrier. It was like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. "Stop it," I heard him say. "I won't listen to you. Go away." And then, silence. Silence so thick, I felt it pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I sat there, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself it was just his illness. But something about the way he spoke, it didn't feel like he was talking to himself. It felt like he was talking to someone who had been waiting. The days that followed were worse. One morning, as I was making coffee, I heard a voice right behind me. "What are you doing?" it asked, soft and chilling. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. My heart was hammering, but I forced myself to laugh it off until Aaron let out a scream from his room down the hall. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice breaking. I stood there, frozen, realizing the voice I'd heard wasn't just in my head. It had come from somewhere, or something. As the days passed, I started noticing a second voice. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe Aaron was just really good at imitating voices. But one night, I turned off the TV and listened. Clear as day, I heard it. A voice, low and malevolent, urging him, taunting him. "Take the knife," it whispered, the words like poison dripping into the silence. "You know what to do." "No," Aaron's voice was desperate. "I won't. Leave me alone." "Take the knife," it repeated, more forceful this time. "Do it, now." A wave of dread washed over me, freezing me to my core. I forced myself to stand and walked to his door, my hand shaking as I raised it to knock. The second I did, the voices stopped, replaced by a silence so unnatural, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I opened the door slowly, my pulse pounding. Aaron was sitting on his bed, his head in his hands, trembling. He looked up at me, eyes hollow and haunted, as though he'd seen something that had clawed its way into his soul. "Are you all right, Aaron?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. He looked away, murmuring, "Just go." I left his room and went straight to the head nurse, telling her everything I'd heard. The voices, the knife, the cold, inescapable dread that seemed to follow him like a curse. She listened in silence, her face pale, and before long, they were moving Aaron to a different facility. They didn't make a big show of it, just quietly took him away, as if afraid that whatever haunted him might be watching. I never saw Aaron again after that night, but the memory stayed, etched into my mind, haunting my sleep. I'd tell myself it was just his illness, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. Aaron wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to something else, something that had wormed its way into his mind, feeding on his fear, driving him to the edge. Years have passed, and I'm clean now, living a life I never thought I'd have. But there are nights when I still hear that voice, the one that wasn't his. And sometimes I can still see his face, eyes wide with terror, pleading with something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. There are places the mind should never wander, things that shouldn't be spoken to. And that night, I realized some shadows aren't cast by light or darkness. They're cast by something far worse, lurking just out of reach, waiting for someone like Aaron to step too close. There's a chill you carry with you forever when you stumble into a place that shouldn't exist. Back in 1982, I was on a bear hunting trip with 5 of my friends, deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. We stayed in some run-down cabins near Twin Lakes, in an area so remote, even the locals seemed to have forgotten it. Bear hunting is a waiting game. We'd go out early morning and late evening, but the long daylight hours left us with nothing but time to kill. So, we decided to explore. The Upper Peninsula is riddled with old logging and mining roads, leftovers from the days when copper was king. These roads run for miles, deep into forested areas that felt untouched for decades. On one of those days, we picked a dirt path so overgrown, it barely looked like a road. We thought we'd go as far as it would take us, and then double back. But as we drove deeper, the trees began to close in above us, forming a canopy so thick that even sunlight struggled to reach the ground. It was like the forest itself was swallowing us whole. After what felt like hours, the trees suddenly broke, and we emerged into a clearing. And there, laid out before us, was a town, a place that seemed trapped in time, silent and still, with row upon row of houses that lined what looked like an abandoned main street. We could hardly believe it. It looked like something out of a Western movie set, preserved but frozen in a thick layer of dust. We parked near what looked like an old general store and got out, wandering down the empty street, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every house was intact, but abandoned, with windows clouded in grime and doors shut tight. The silence was so complete, it felt like we were underwater. It was eerie, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Ryan nudged me, his voice a whisper, though I couldn't understand why he felt the need to be so quiet. "Jake, you ever seen anything like this?" I shook my head, scanning the empty windows. "Not once." We continued, drawn to a large building at the top of a hill that overlooked the town. It It was covered in rusted corrugated metal, the kind you see on old mines. And as we got closer, we noticed a gap in the siding where we could slip inside. The interior was cavernous, high ceilings with beams and supports that looked ready to collapse. Sunlight spilled in through broken windows, casting strange, elongated shadows. And then we saw it, a massive pit in the center of the room, a deep, dark hole easily 15 feet across. We crept closer, peering over the edge into the blackness. The bottom was invisible, a void that seemed to pull at you. One of the guys grabbed a rock, leaned over, and dropped it. We waited, our breath held, listening as the rock fell and fell, until finally, after about 10 seconds, we heard a faint splash echo up. Someone pulled out an old stopwatch and timed it again. A 400-foot drop, maybe more. The pit had no barriers, no warnings, just an open, yawning chasm that seemed to beckon you forward, like it was daring you to come closer. The longer we stared, the more it felt like it was watching us back. We couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong here, something that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to venture this deep. We snapped photos on our old film cameras and left as the daylight began to fade. The silence and the thick, still air felt suffocating, as if the town was closing in on us. By the time we made it back to the cabins, dusk was falling, and we'd pushed the strange town out of our minds, ready to refocus on the hunt. That night, we headed to a local bar, still buzzing about what we'd seen. We asked the bartender if she knew anything about the place. She froze, her expression changing as she excused herself to get the cook, a man named Joe, who'd lived in the area his whole life. Joe came out, his face serious as he looked us over. "You boys found Peterson, didn't you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. We nodded, still puzzled. "Yeah, but we didn't see a sign or anything. How did you know the name?" Joe's face paled. "Because Peterson doesn't exist anymore," he said, his words sinking like stones. "At least, not like you'd think." We exchanged glances, not quite believing what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to laugh it off. We walked down the streets, saw the buildings, took pictures. It was real. Joe shook his head, his expression haunted. "People see Peterson sometimes, sure, just once. It shows itself to those who stumble on it. But it's a ghost town, not in the normal sense. It's like a mirage. Try going back. You won't find it." Our disbelief was plain, but Joe didn't stop. "Did you drop a rock down a pit in the big building?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We froze, the memory of that endless drop rushing back. "Yeah," I said slowly, my throat dry. 400 feet, right?" He nodded. "I've been there too. So have others. But here's the thing. None of us ever found it again. It just vanishes." The next day, we took our film rolls to a photo developer in Hancock. When we picked up the pictures, we tore into the envelopes eagerly. But as we flipped through, something was wrong. We'd taken plenty of shots, images of the forest, the cabins, Misery Bay, even the drive. But of Peterson, there was nothing. Not a single photo of the town, the pit, the streets. It was as if those moments had been erased, leaving us only with fragments of memory. We went back to the bar that night, showing Joe the photos we had. examined them with a knowing look, as if he'd expected this all along. "That's how it works," he said, almost to himself. "Peterson never leaves proof, only a memory." For the rest of our trip, we were obsessed. We split up, retraced every road we could remember, every turn, every landmark. But the forest swallowed us whole, and Peterson had vanished. Every time we thought we'd found the right path, it twisted into somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere empty. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't know if Peterson was ever real, or if it's just a strange, unexplainable phenomenon that surfaces in the depths of those woods. All I know is that something happened in that forgotten town. Peterson, or whatever it was, left us haunted, questioning the world we thought we knew. It happened at 2:30 a.m., I remember, because I'd glanced at the clock, eager for my shift to end. I'd been working nights at the gas station for a year, a small, isolated place just beyond the town's edge, where shadows stretched long and deep. Most nights, I sat behind the counter, counting cash or watching the seconds drag on the clock. The stillness was routine, even comforting. But that night, silence held its breath. I had just finished counting the last stack of bills when the front door slammed open with a force that sent a jolt through my chest. The crash echoed in the empty store, louder than the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. My eyes snapped up, and for a split second, I couldn't move. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim glow of the parking lot. He was disheveled, clothes rumpled and stained, hair tangled like a nest. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted around the room before locking onto the cash in my hands. There was something animalistic in his gaze, wild and unhinged. The sour stench of sweat and something metallic hit me as he stepped inside. His breath ragged, like he'd been running for miles. Before I could react, he lunged. The bills slipped from my fingers as he grabbed at them, his rough hands brushing mine in a desperate snatch. Time fractured. One moment I was holding the cash. The next, it was gone, stuffed into his pocket as he stumbled toward the exit. Something snapped in me. Without thinking, I vaulted over the counter, shouting, "Stop!" The word felt useless as it left my mouth, swallowed by the thick tension. He was already out the door, his steps uneven, as if his legs weren't quite his own. My heart pounded as I chased him, my pulse drowning out any rational thought. "Hey, stop!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. The parking lot was cold, the air biting at my skin, but I didn't feel it. I only saw him, the way he wavered, the erratic movements, the money sticking out of his torn jacket. He turned, eyes wide with panic, and tripped on the cracked pavement. His hands flailed, but he caught himself, barely managing to stay upright. I lunged, grabbing his arm. The contact felt electric, a jolt of adrenaline surging through both of us. He twisted, eyes flaring with fear, and something deeper, desperation. We struggled, limbs tangling, each movement clumsy and raw. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, the sound ragged in the quiet night. Suddenly, he broke free, staggering forward. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, detached, as I stammered out my location and what had happened. "Police are on their way," she said, but her words felt distant, unreal. The man had slowed, the initial burst of energy fading. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting like a trapped animal. I kept my distance now, watching as he limped toward the edge of the lot. My chest tightened. Who knew what a cornered man would do? The faint wail of sirens sliced through the silence. His body tensed, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then, the flashing lights washed over us, red and blue cutting through the dark. The police cars skidded into the lot, tires screeching. Officers spilled out, their voices sharp and commanding. "Get on the ground," they yelled, guns raised, their shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt. He froze, shoulders slumping as if the fight had left him. Slowly, he dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he clasped them behind his head. The officers moved in, cuffing him and pulling him to his feet. One of them, a tall man with a sharp, searching gaze, turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, my breath finally catching up with me, each inhale shaky and shallow. I recounted what happened, the words spilling out, jagged and uneven. My hands still shook as I spoke, the adrenaline refusing to fade. They searched him, pulling the crumpled bills from his pocket. One of the officers shook his head, muttering, "Desperate, probably homeless on something." The reality of it hit me then. The man's eyes, now dulled and empty, stared at the ground as they led him to the back of the squad car. The harsh light revealed his gaunt face, skin stretched tight over sharp bones. A strange mix of relief and pity washed over me. I had been seconds away from something far worse, and he, beaten by life and addiction, had made a choice that ended with steel cuffs and flashing lights. The officers thanked me, though one warned that chasing him could have ended differently. I nodded, swallowing the lingering fear. The gas station felt different when I stepped back inside. The cold, fluorescent glow, no longer familiar, but harsh and sterile. I sat behind the counter, staring at the door as if expecting it to fly open again, hands still trembling. The clock inched toward morning, but I didn't count the minutes. I just waited, the night pressing in, heavy with what had almost been. When my shift ended and I locked the door behind me, the dawn was just a gray hint on the horizon. I glanced at the lot one last time before getting into my car. The air was cool, quiet again. As I drove home, the scene replayed in my head. The wild eyes, the desperation, the sudden silence after the sirens. I knew I was lucky. It could have gone differently. And as I turned down the road toward home, the realization settled deep. In that moment, I had stared into chaos, and it had stared right back. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.